Our gospel is from the 20th chapter of John's Gospel. It's on page 883 in your pew Bibles. We'll be looking at the last two verses of that chapter. After Jesus had appeared to the disciples and had his conversation with Thomas, John goes on to say this: "Now Jesus did many other things in the presence of his disciples which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name." Friends, this is the gospel of the Lord. I invite you to please be seated. It might be the best known phrase in advertising. It's one which excites us, it entices us, it draws us in to want to know more. I'm speaking, of course, of those four words made famous by Mr. Ron Popeil, the man who brought you the Vegematic, the giant food dehydrator, and of course, the pocket fisherman. Those four words, but wait, there's more. That's the message in our gospel reading to this weekend. John writes that Jesus did a bunch of other things that he didn't include in the book, but he wrote these down so that his readers, his hearers, might know and believe. For those of you keeping score, John actually says something similar in just a little bit. The last verse of John's gospel reads, "But there are also many other things that Jesus did. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written." This is John's way of saying, but wait, there's more. The story of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Word of God made flesh, the Son of God coming into the world, the Messiah, isn't finished. There's more to be said because there's more happening. This story isn't over. And it's still not over. You heard some great stories today. Thanks again to each of our young people for sharing their stories of how they experience God through their summer ministry. Theirs are great stories. I hope you're as inspired as I am. Sometimes people ask me why I do these trips year after year. "You know, Dean, you're not getting any younger," I'll hear on occasion. Usually from myself. But the reason I do is because I get a chance to see and hear their stories firsthand. But really, who signs up for a trip when they have no idea where they're going? David, and he took his mom with him, which is fantastic, and a whole group of other folks. And they had a phenomenal trip with lots of great stories. Who signs up for a trip where you know you're going to be serving in Detroit, downtown Detroit, in the midst of summer heat and humidity? Well, Grace and 34 others of us did. Who goes to New Orleans, the land of jazz and beignets, so that you can drive through the Ninth Ward every single day and play with groups of underprivileged kids, and then voluntarily hang out in a prison? Well, there were 13 of us who did that, and it was phenomenal. Now, as wonderful as these stories are, we all know that God's story is written in more places than just church camps and church trips. God's story is written in each and every one of our lives. When John writes, "But wait, there's more," John's writing about your stories and mine. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to share one of your God stories with someone around you. But first, I'll share one of mine from this summer. Now, ordinarily, when we're planning a trip, we have a pretty good idea of what we're going to do. Usually, trip planning starts now, actually, as it already has. By the time we get to September, October, we have a plan, we have a goal, we know at least where we're going, and we start to pray about how these things might fit together. We were getting ready for this June trip to New Orleans, and I felt like a plan was missing, even as we got into February and March, and even into April. Something was missing, completely absent. It didn't have the kind of focus I wanted. We weren't quite sure what we were doing. I followed a lot of different trails for pulling a meaningful capstone-type trip together. And it just wasn't happening in a way that was satisfactory to me. So with less than a month to go before our trip, I went and did a little research down in New Orleans. I met with some folks, including a friend of mine, a man named Andrew Ward. I met Andrew during our 2012 trip to the ELCA Youth Gathering in New Orleans. Andrew was our extravagant tour guide for our haunted history trip in downtown. And after I met him, we became friends. We communicated back and forth. Andrew is a guy who knows New Orleans very, very well. Now, one of our group's goals that Emma talked about, we had a group of kids who said, we want to experience real New Orleans. We don't want to just do the touristy stuff. We want to know authentic New Orleans. So I talked to my friend Andrew. I said, hey, let's get together. I'm going to be in town for a couple days. We went out to a coffee shop with the intended goal of finding out some great restaurants. That's all I wanted to know. Andrew, where are some places I can take this group of 13 people that they can experience real New Orleans? But during the course of our conversation, God wrote a different story. As we talked, Andrew said, so now who are these people? And I told him, and he said, now why are you coming? And I told him. And as we talked more and more, I said, Andrew, I have a question for you. Andrew, the last time we talked, when we were here in 2012, you were working on a PhD in economics at Tulane. Now you're the program manager for a radio station that broadcasts no further than 5 miles out in any given direction if the wind is blowing right. What happened? Andrew said, I was working on my doctorate, and a little thing called Katrina happened. And the disruption caused by Hurricane Katrina revealed many, many shortcomings in the systems that were supposedly in place to help people who live in poverty, of which there are many in New Orleans. He said, once you see an injustice like that, you can't unsee it. And if you see it and you fail to act on it, and these are his words, that makes you a miserable human being. And so he set about to learn and then to do things that would make a difference, including his involvement with this little tiny radio station called WHIV. The call letters stand for We Honor Independent Voices. It's a station whose mission is dedicated to programming related to social justice, to public health care, to talking about basic human rights. As we talked, I said, Andrew, I think you might have found your calling in this. He asked me what that meant. He'd never heard that vocabulary before. I said, Andrew, you have found that unique place where your gifts, your passions, and your abilities and your connections meet perfectly with a very real need in the world. Andrew, you have found that magnificent intersection that many people go their entire lives seeking. And he was amazed. He'd never thought about that before. And so then as we talked even further, Andrew said, I have an idea. What if you take your kids and you ask them before you leave about some of those things? What does social justice mean to them? What is a basic human right? What does public health care look like? And then serve for a few days, and then bring them back to the radio station. What if we put them on the air and people can hear their voices? And he said, if you really want to go for the challenge round, maybe you can bring them to the Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola. And I said, Andrew, I don't know what that is. And he said, it used to be the bloodiest, worst, most horrific prison in the United States. I said, that sounds like a perfect place to bring a group of high school kids from small town in Minnesota. And he said, I think you need to go there. I said, well, we'll have to think about that. Our time is limited. Well, I came back, and a few weeks before our trip, we had that conversation about those topics. And we had a great conversation to the point where I decided to call Angola to set up a tour. I checked in with Andrew the week before we left, and he said, all right, so what's your schedule look like? And I told him, and I said, but Andrew, I'm really having a tough time connecting with the person who coordinates the tours in Angola. And Andrew said, I'll do you one better. Hang on. And there was a pause, and they said, I've just emailed you the contact information for one of their assistant wardens. He's a great guy. Tell him I sent you. He'll take care of you. And so within minutes, I found myself on the phone talking to the assistant warden of Louisiana State Penitentiary, coordinating a trip. And that's my story. about how I managed to take a group of kids from Minnesota into one of the worst, bloodiest prisons and most horrific, bloodiest prisons in America for a summer trip. I'm glad that I'm still employed. And the best part was, it was a life-changing event. All of these things that Andrew helped clarify and put together were magnificent and powerful, and would have been things that I never would have thought to put together myself, including the kids being broadcast on the air. It was so actually remarkable. Andrew had a plan to kind of record and then maybe edit and then air them with his radio show that evening. But he said the first group that came in were so well prepared and they had such wonderful thoughts, I didn't want to lose that. So I put them on the air right away. And then we watched as his phone lit up all afternoon with friends texting him, "Who are these kids? They're amazing." And friends, all of this from a chance meeting in 2012 with a tour guide who I became friends with. It's a strange story, but to me, it's an amazing story of how God's Spirit works all the time, through connections, through what we consider chance encounters, through relationships, through opportunities that we had never even imagined. What about you? What are your stories of faith? When have you been acutely aware of God's work in your life? Maybe this past year, maybe the past 5 years, maybe the past 10. Take just a few minutes now to share a story. Take some time to listen and to share. You are the living chapters of God's story. Let's share a few of those chapters right now. Ready? Go. Now, I know there are many more stories to be shared. I also know that many of you spent the first 30 seconds talking about how uncomfortable and awkward that was. So thank you for breaking through that and moving on. Friends, there are so many stories waiting to be written. Stories that we write in our everyday work as parents, as grandparents, as friends, as brothers, as sisters, as students, as workers, and all of those things. God's still writing his story, and I'm exceptionally thankful for all of those. I'm exceptionally thankful for each of our kids and our parents and our adult leaders who go on these trips where we take time to be acutely aware of what God's doing in our lives and taking time to really name those things and put our fingers on them and say, this truly is the work of God. But even more, I'm thankful for the way that from time to time we're reminded that the story's not over. From time to time, we hear God say, but wait, there's more. Friends, this is really good news. Amen.